The portrait reached Rebecca Hoffman's restoration studio in Boston on a dull gray morning in March, shipped from an estate sale in Providence, Rhode Island. The package held a single photograph set in an ornate silver frame, darkened by age but still striking. Rebecca gently removed the backing and slid out the photograph, her skilled hands moving with the care she had developed over 15 years of working with historic images. The wedding portrait was dated 1910, written in pale, fading ink on the back. Mr. and Mrs. William Crawford, June 18th, 1910. The couple stood and sat in the classic Edwardian pose, placed before a painted studio backdrop of columns and garden scenery common at the time. The groom stood straight and serious in a dark suit with a high collar, one hand resting on the back of an elaborate chair. The bride sat in the chair, her white gown spilling around her in soft layers of silk and lace, her veil drawn back to show her face. Rebecca placed the photograph beneath her examination lamp and began her first inspection. For an image more than a century old, it was in surprisingly good shape. The sepia tones remained deep, and the fine details were still clear. The photographer had clearly been talented, capturing the texture of the bride's dress, the shine of her dark hair, styled in the Gibson girl fashion, and the stiff nervousness visible in both faces. Rebecca wrote these notes in her restoration log, then leaned in closer, studying the image through her magnifying glass. The bride's face showed delicate lines, high cheekbones, and large dark eyes that seemed unusually intense even after 114 years. Her skin appeared light in tone, though the sepia coloring made it hard to be certain. The groom looked slightly older, likely in his late 20s, wearing the serious expression common in photographs of that era, when long exposure times required subjects to stay perfectly still. As Rebecca's magnifying glass moved downward to the bride's bouquet, a flowing arrangement of roses and lilies, she stopped at the bride's left hand, resting in her lap beneath the flowers. Something about the fingers looked strange, though at this level of magnification she could not yet tell what had drawn her attention. The photograph would need a high-resolution scan. Rebecca felt the familiar sense of curiosity that made her love her profession. Every old photograph carried a story, but some carried puzzles. There was something in the bride's face, a quiet sadness visible beneath the proper expression demanded by the standards of 1910, that suggested this image held a deeper truth. She prepared her scanner, ready to uncover whatever details lay hidden in this century-old wedding portrait. Rebecca spent the rest of the afternoon scanning the image at the highest possible resolution. Her modern restoration equipment captured every tiny detail at 4,800 dots per inch. The digital file was enormous, allowing her to zoom in closely without losing clarity. She opened it on her large monitor and began the careful review she followed for every project, starting with the faces and slowly working downward. The bride's expression, now seen in remarkable detail, appeared even more complex than Rebecca had first thought. There was strain around the eyes and a tightness to the smile that suggested it was forced rather than natural. Rebecca zoomed in on the bride's hands resting in her lap, partly hidden by the spilling bouquet. The left hand was placed to show the wedding ring, as tradition required. But when Rebecca increased the magnification to 1000%, her breath caught. The bride was wearing 2 rings on her left ring finger, not stacked in a modern way, but linked together in an unusual manner. One ring looked like gold, new and traditional, reflecting the studio lights with a clean shine. The other was different, simpler, possibly silver or white gold, with a dull surface that suggested age. Rebecca leaned closer to the screen, adjusting contrast and sharpness. The rings were clearly meant to be worn together, not placed randomly, but carefully, connected, almost woven. In the hundreds of historic wedding photos she had restored, she had never seen rings worn like this. She zoomed in even further, studying every mark. The gold band was smooth and polished, typical of wedding rings from that time. The silver band, however, showed long use, fine scratches, a slight bend in the metal, and the software of a ring that had been worn daily for years before this photograph. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, her thoughts racing. Perhaps it was a family heirloom, but why thread it together with the wedding ring instead of wearing it on another finger? And why did the arrangement feel secretive, as if the bride wanted it to be seen, but not clearly noticed, partly hidden beneath the flowers? Rebecca turned the photo over again and reread the writing. Mr. and Mrs. William Crawford, June 18, 1910. No location was listed, but the embossed studio mark in the corner read Sullivan and Sons Photography, Boston, Massachusetts. Rebecca picked up her phone and began checking historical records. Sullivan and Sons had operated in Boston from 1895 to 1923 and was known as a respected studio serving middle and upper middle class clients. If the Crawfords were photographed there, they likely lived in or near Boston. She opened her genealogy database and searched for a William Crawford married in June 1910 in Massachusetts. Several results appeared, but one matched closely. William Arthur Crawford, age 28, married Helen Marie Porter, age 23, on June 18, 1910, in Boston. The marriage record listed William's occupation as attorney and noted that Helen's father, Thomas Porter, was deceased. Rebecca saved the record and returned to the image, once again enlarging the view of the strange linked rings. What story did they hold? And why did she feel certain that understanding them would explain the sadness she saw in Helen Crawford's eyes? The next morning, Rebecca visited the Massachusetts State Archives, began searching records connected to the Crawford and Porter families. The marriage certificate for William and Helen gave her the first real clue. Helen Marie Porter's birthplace was listed as New Orleans, Louisiana, and her mother's name appeared only as Marie Porter, marked deceased. This stood out, as most marriage records from that period listed the mother's maiden name. Rebecca noted this detail and continued her research. William Crawford's birth certificate was easy to find. He came from a long-established Boston family, with both parents clearly named along with their occupation. Helen Porter's birth certificate, however, was harder to locate. After 3 hours searching through New Orleans records that had been transferred to microfilm and digitized, Rebecca finally found a certificate dated March 15, 1882, for Helen Maria Porter. The document listed her father as Thomas Porter, merchant, and her mother as Marie Beaumont Porter. Yet something about the record seemed off. The handwriting appeared slightly different in certain areas, as if parts had been changed or rewritten later. Rebecca photographed the document with her phone and studied it more closely. The mother's maiden name, Beaumont, appeared to have been written over another name that had been carefully erased or scratched away. Rebecca could barely see faint letters underneath, possibly spelling something else. She searched New Orleans records for Marie Beaumont and found nothing at all. There was no birth record, no marriage record to Thomas Porter, and no death certificate. It was as if Marie Beaumont had never existed before Helen's birth certificate was created. However, when Rebecca searched for Marie Porter without a maiden name, she discovered a death certificate dated 1902, when Helen would have been about 15 years old. The cause of death was listed as consumption, and the place of death was Charity Hospital in New Orleans. The person who reported the death was listed as Helen Porter, daughter. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, thinking carefully. A mother with no clear history before her child's birth. A birth certificate that showed signs of being changed. A father who died before his daughter's wedding, leaving little trace behind. She opened the wedding portrait again on her laptop and studied Helen's face with fresh eyes. In 1910, New Orleans was a racially complex city with a large Creole population. These were people of mixed French, Spanish, African, and Native American ancestry who lived in a shifting and uncertain space as racial divisions became more rigid under Jim Crow laws. Rebecca felt a sudden chill of understanding. She had read about people with mixed racial backgrounds who were light-skinned enough to present themselves as white in order to escape discrimination and gain access to opportunities denied to Black Americans. Could Helen Porter have been doing this? Was that the reason her mother's maiden name had been changed on the birth certificate? Was that why Marie Porter seemed to leave no official record behind? And if this was true, what was the meaning of the two rings? Rebecca zoomed in again on the worn silver ring, threaded together with the new gold wedding band. Could the silver ring have belonged to Marie Porter, Helen's mother? A mother who could not attend her daughter's wedding because her presence would expose the truth about Helen's identity. Rebecca knew she needed to learn more about Marie Porter and the life Helen left behind in New Orleans before marrying William Crawford and becoming part of white society in Boston. Rebecca reached out to Dr. Simone Rousseau, a historian at Tulane University who specialized in Creole history and racial passing in Louisiana. After explaining what she had found, Rebecca emailed Dr. Rousseau high-resolution images of Helen's birth certificate and the wedding portrait, focusing especially on the two rings. Dr. Rousseau called back within 2 hours, her voice full of excitement. She said Rebecca had uncovered something important. The altered name on the birth certificate was a strong clue. Dubois was a common Creole surname in New Orleans, and if the original name had been Dubois and later changed to Beaumont, it suggested a deliberate effort to hide racial identity. Rebecca asked if Dr. Rousseau could help trace Marie's true history. Dr. Rousseau agreed and said she would search local archives, including church records that often held details missing from official documents. She asked for a few days. 3 days later, Dr. Rousseau sent a long email explaining what she had found. She had located baptism records from St. Augustine Church, the historic Black Catholic church, in the Treme neighborhood of New Orleans. In 1865, a Marie Dubois had been baptized there, the daughter of Jean-Baptiste Dubois, a free man of color, and Celeste Marchamp, a free woman of color. Further, research showed that Marie Dubois married Thomas Porter in 1886 in a small ceremony recorded only in church records, not in the city's official registry. Thomas Porter appeared in the 1880 census as a white merchant from Pennsylvania who had moved to New Orleans after the Civil War. Dr. Rousseau explained that this was not unusual. During Reconstruction and the years that followed, some interracial marriages occurred in New Orleans, though they became more dangerous over time and were officially outlawed by Louisiana law in 1894. Thomas and Marie likely kept their marriage quiet, and Marie may have begun presenting G herself as white or Creole, an unclear racial category that sometimes allowed limited social movement. Dr. Rousseau also discovered a photograph in the St. Augustine Church archives dated around 1890, labeled Porter Family. The image showed Thomas Porter, a serious-looking white man, standing next to a seated woman holding a small child. The woman, believed to be Marie, had light brown skin and gentle features that closely resembled those Rebecca had seen in Helen's wedding portrait. Marie was light-skinned, but in the racial climate of Louisiana in the late 1800s and early 1900s, she would still have been identified as a person of color. Dr. Rousseau explained during a follow-up call that as segregation law tightened, the family would have faced growing danger and discrimination. When Thomas died in 1899, Marie and Helen would have been especially vulnerable. Rebecca looked again at Helen's wedding portrait, now fully understanding the weight behind her controlled expression. So, when Helen moved to Boston and married William Crawford, she was passing as white. Dr. Rousseau confirmed that Helen's light skin would have made this possible, especially once she left New Orleans, where people might have known her past. In Boston, with her father gone and her records altered, Helen could present herself simply as a white woman from Louisiana. But her mother could not attend the wedding, Rebecca said quietly, because Marie's presence would expose the truth. Dr. Rousseau agreed. She also suspected that Marie died shortly after Helen left the South. The death certificate from 1902 listed Helen as the informant. Even though Helen was only 15 years old, Dr. Rousseau wondered if Marie had sent her daughter north on purpose, giving her a chance to escape the harsh racial laws of the South. Rebecca thought again about the two rings joined together on Helen's finger in the wedding portrait. A daughter wearing her mother's ring on her wedding day, honoring the woman who could not be there, carrying a secret that could destroy her new life if it were ever revealed. Rebecca's final breakthrough came from an unexpected place. After she published a short article about the wedding portrait in a restoration journal, she received an email from a woman named Patricia Whitmore in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Patricia wrote that her grandmother had grown up next door to the Crawford family in Boston's Back Bay neighborhood during the 1920s and 1930s. Her grandmother often said, "There was something sad about Mrs. Crawford. She was kind but very private, rarely went to social events, and seemed deeply lonely." Patricia explained that when her grandmother's family moved in during 1938, Mrs. Crawford gave her a small jewelry box with a note that said, "Keep this safe. Someday it may matter." Her grandmother kept the box her entire life without opening it, honoring Mrs. Crawford's wish. She later passed it to Patricia's mother, who then gave it to Patricia. After reading Rebecca's article, Patricia felt it might finally be time to open it. Rebecca met Patricia at a cafe near Harvard Square. Patricia brought a small wooden jewelry box, simple but graceful, with brass hinges and an uncomplicated clasp. Inside, wrapped in thin tissue paper, was a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Rebecca carefully untied the ribbon, her hands steady despite her growing excitement. There were 15 letters in total, each addressed to my dearest Helen, and each signed, "Your loving mother." The letters were dated between 1903 and 1907 and were written in neat, educated handwriting on plain stationery. Patricia had agreed to let Rebecca read them, understanding how important they were. Historically, Rebecca began with the first letter, dated January 1903. "My dearest Helen, you have been in Boston for 6 months now, and I pray every day that you are safe and content. I know you cannot write to me at the old address, so I have arranged for Father Michel at the church to receive letters on my behalf. I understand why you must live the way you do now. I want you to have every chance that was denied to me and to your father after. The new laws were passed, but my heart aches knowing I may never see you again." Rebecca felt tears burn her eyes as she continued reading. The letters described Marie's lonely life in New Orleans after Helen left, her work as a seamstress to support herself, her pride in Helen's letters about life in Boston, and her quiet acceptance of why Helen could never openly acknowledge their bond. One letter from June 1905 was especially moving. "You wrote that you have met a young man, a lawyer from a respectable family. I am glad for you, my precious girl, though I understand what this means. When you marry, I will not be there. I cannot be there, but I want you to have something of mine, something from our family, to carry with you on that day." The following letter, dated July 1905, explained more. "I am sending you my wedding ring, the one your father placed on my finger in 1886. I have worn it every day since then, even after he died, even as the world became harsher for people like us. I want you to wear it on your wedding day, however you must manage it. Thread it together with your new ring if you need to hide it. But let it be there, a promise that your mother's love is with you, even if I cannot be." Rebecca looked up at Patricia, wiping her cheeks. She sent Helen her wedding ring to wear on her wedding day. Patricia nodded through her own tears. So the two rings in the photograph made sense now. One was Helen's new ring from William Crawford. The other was Marie's ring linked with it and hidden in plain sight. Helen had found a way to honor her mother while still living a lie. Rebecca spent the next week researching the Crawford family's life in Boston. City directories showed William and Helen living in the Back Bay area, one of the city's most respected neighborhoods. William's law practice did well, and he appeared as a member of several professional groups. Helen was mentioned occasionally in society pages, usually connected to charity work at the Episcopal church they attended. On the surface, they appeared to be a successful and respectable white couple, but Rebecca now saw every detail differently. Helen never returned to Louisiana. No family members were listed in any records. When asked about her background in social columns, she described herself only as being from a small New Orleans family without details. The couple had 2 children, William Jr., born in 1911, and Margaret, born in 1913. Rebecca located both birth certificates, which listed both parents as white, and gave Helen's birthplace as Louisiana without naming a city. She wondered how Helen felt filling out those forms, officially removing her mother's heritage from her children's identities. Through newspaper archives, Rebecca followed the family's story over the years. William Crawford died in 1945. His obituary mentioned his wife, their 2 children, and 4 grandchildren. Helen lived until 1962 and died at the age of 75. Her obituary was short, noting her charity work and her surviving family, but saying nothing about her early life or family history. Rebecca found a photograph from 1940 in a society column showing Helen at a charity event. She was 53, elegant and calm, wearing pearls and a dark dress, but Rebecca could still see the same sadness in her eyes that had been present in the 1910 wedding portrait, a loneliness that decade had not erased. Dr. Russo later sent more information about Marie Porter. Church records showed that Marie had died in 1907 at age 42, listed as Marie Porter, widow, in the death registry of St. Augustine Church. She was buried in an unmarked grave in a segregated Catholic cemetery in New Orleans. Helen had been 20 years old at the time, already married and living as a white woman in Boston, unable to attend her mother's funeral without exposing her secret. Rebecca found one last letter in the collection Patricia had shared. It was dated March 1907 and written in a shaky hand, very different from Marie's earlier letters. My dear Helen, I write what may be my final letter to you. The consumption has grown worse, and Father Michel says I must prepare myself. I am not afraid of death, but I grieve that I never saw you as a bride, never held your son who was born last year. I understand why you could not tell me sooner about the baby. Letters can be taken, secrets uncovered. But Father Michel showed me your telegram telling him of William's birth, and I cried with joy knowing you are now a mother. Wear my ring always, my child. Let it remind you that you carry your mother's love and your grandmother's strength. You may live as a white woman, but you carry the blood of free people of color who fought for dignity and survival. Never forget who you truly are, even if you can never speak it aloud. You'd, with all my love, until we meet again in heaven, Mother. Finding Helen and William's descendants took careful effort. Rebecca began with the obituaries, which mentioned children and grandchildren but gave no names. Using genealogy databases and census records, she eventually identified 3 living great-grandchildren of Helen and William Crawford. The first person she contacted was Thomas Crawford, age 68, the grandson of William Jr., who lived in Portland, Maine. Rebecca called him and gently explained her research. She told him she was restoring a wedding portrait of his great-grandparents and had uncovered some important family history. Thomas was interested right away. He said he never knew much about his great-grandmother Helen. She died when his father was still a teenager, and his father always said she was quiet and private, never speaking about her childhood or her family in Louisiana. They had assumed she came from a family ruined after the Civil War, and preferred not to talk about it. Rebecca asked if she could visit and show him the portrait and the documents she had found. Thomas agreed, and the next week Rebecca drove to Portland with her laptop and copies of the letters and records. Sitting in Thomas's living room, she first showed him the restored wedding portrait. Zooming in on the detail of the 2 rings, Thomas leaned closer to the screen. He said he had never noticed that before. 2 rings? Rebecca nodded and explained that one was Helen's wedding ring from his great-grandfather. The other belonged to her mother, Marie Porter, who could not attend the wedding. Thomas asked why she could not attend. Rebecca took a slow breath and explained that Helen was passing as white and her mother's presence would have revealed that Helen had black ancestry. Marie was a free woman of color from New Orleans who sent Helen north to escape segregation and gain opportunities denied to her in Louisiana. Thomas sat quietly for a long time. Then he asked if that meant his great-grandmother was black, at least in part. Rebecca explained that Helen was mixed race, Creole by the terms of the time, and light-skinned enough to pass as white once she left Louisiana and changed her records. Rebecca showed him the birth certificate, the letters, and the photograph of Marie. Thomas stood and walked to the window, staring outside. When he turned back, his eyes were filled with tears. He said that his whole life and his father's life, they had identified as white and never knew this truth. Rebecca apologized, saying she was unsure whether to share the information but felt it was important family history. Thomas shook his head and said she was right to tell him. He said it changed how he thought about his family and himself. He picked up Marie Porter's photograph and said this was his great-great-grandmother, and that her story deserved to be known. He told Rebecca that his sister and cousin should know as well over the next 2 weeks. Rebecca met with Elizabeth Crawford Simmons, age 65, who lived in Philadelphia, and David Crawford, age 70, who lived in Boston. Both reacted in similar ways. First came shock, followed by a strong need to understand and respect the truth about their ancestor. Elizabeth held the wedding portrait in her hands, tears flowing freely down her face. She said Helen had lived her entire life carrying this secret and asked how anyone could bear that weight every single day, never able to speak about her mother or her true identity. David responded more thoughtfully, asking careful questions about the historical background, the laws Helen had avoided, and the risks she had taken. After a long pause, he said she must have been incredibly brave and also deeply alone. It made sense now why his grandfather had always said Helen seemed sad. As Rebecca continued to study Helen's life, she uncovered another important detail. While reviewing jewelry records from the Crawford estate, Patricia Whitmore had put her in touch with the lawyer who handled Helen's will in 1962. Rebecca found an inventory list that included one mourning ring, Victorian style, a worn silver band engraved with the initials MP. Mourning rings were common in the Victorian period and were often given to relatives after a death, usually marked with initials and dates. Helen's ring, however, had never been passed down to her children. According to the inventory, Helen had requested that it be buried with her. Rebecca contacted Mount Auburn Cemetery, where Helen was buried, and after explaining her research, she was granted access to the burial records. The undertaker's notes from 1962 listed the personal items placed with Helen's body, following her written instructions from 1960. The notes stated that one silver mourning ring was placed on her right hand and one unframed photograph was placed inside the casket pocket. A photograph in the coffin. Rebecca felt a chill run through her. She knew she would never see that image, but she could imagine it clearly. It had to be Marie Porter, Helen's mother, the woman whose existence Helen had hidden all her life, while quietly honoring her in private. Rebecca contacted Patricia Whitmore again and asked if her grandmother had ever mentioned anything else about Mrs. Crawford. Patricia thought for a moment, then remembered something important. Her grandmother had said that every year, on March 15th, which Patricia now realized was Helen's birthday, Mrs. Crawford would spend the entire day alone in her bedroom. She would not accept visitors and would not even come downstairs to eat. Patricia's grandmother's mother, who was friendly with the Crawfords' housekeeper, said that on those days Mrs. Crawford could be heard crying, though she never explained why. March 15th, 1887 was the date on Helen's birth certificate, the last official document that listed her mother's name before it was altered and erased. Each year, on her birthday day, Helen mourned in silence, grieving not only her mother, but also the identity she was forced to hide. Rebecca uncovered one final document that shed more light on Helen's private life. It was a receipt from 1935, showing a donation to a Negro education fund based in New Orleans. The amount was large, $500, equal to about $10,000 today, and it had been given anonymously through a lawyer. However, Rebecca was able to trace the payment back to Helen using banking records preserved in the Crawford family's legal files. Helen had found a way to support black education in her mother's hometown, honoring Marie's roots while continuing to live as a white woman. It was a quiet act of resistance, a way to stay connected to the community she had been forced to leave behind. Rebecca shared this finding with Helen's great-grandchildren. Thomas stared at the donation receipt and shook his head in disbelief. He said Helen had never forgotten. Even after all those years in an entirely different life, she never forgot where she came from. Elizabeth gently touched the paper and said Helen could not claim her mother publicly, could not attend her funeral, and could not tell her children the truth, but she still found ways to honor Marie. The ring on her wedding day, the donations, and the private mourning every birthday. David added quietly that now at last someone knew the truth and was telling her story. Helen and William Crawford's three great-grandchildren decided to meet together for the first time since they were young. They gathered at David's home in Boston, where Rebecca agreed to present everything she had discovered and help them decide what to do with the information. Rebecca brought all her materials with her: the restored wedding portrait, copies of the letters, photographs of Marie Porter, documents about Helen's life in Boston, and proof of her secret donation. She spread everything across David's dining table, forming a clear timeline of Helen's life and the difficult choices she had made. The three descendants spent hours reviewing the materials, asking questions, and absorbing their family's hidden past. Thomas kept returning to the photograph of Marie holding baby Helen. He said she was his great-great-grandmother, and he was only learning about her now, more than 100 years after her death. He wondered how many other family members had lived and died without knowing. The truth. Elizabeth shared research she had done before the meeting. Helen and William had 2 children. Those children had 5 children of their own, their parents' generation. Those 5 had 12 children their generation, and together they had already had 17 children. That meant 34 descendants had lived without knowing this history. David struggled with what this meant. His son was applying to colleges, and the forms always asked about race and ethnicity. They had always checked white, but now he questioned whether that was completely accurate. They had African ancestry through Helen and Marie. Rebecca explained carefully that it was complicated. Helen passed as white, and her children and grandchildren were raised as white and experienced white privilege. At the same time, their black ancestry had been deliberately hidden. How they chose to identify was a personal choice. Elizabeth spoke firmly and said she believed they needed to tell the truth, not to claim an identity they had not lived, but to honor Helen and Marie's story and stop continuing the erasure Helen had been forced into. Thomas agreed, but asked how they could do that without appearing to take on experiences they had never had. Rebecca suggested creating a public record focused not on themselves, but on Helen and Marie. Their story mattered historically. It showed how racial passing worked, the painful choices people faced, and the human cost of segregation and anti-miscegenation laws. Helen's story made history personal and real. After several hours of discussion, the 3 descendants agreed on a plan. They would donate the wedding portrait, the letters, and all related material to the Massachusetts Historical Society for Preservation and Research. They would take part in an oral history project describing what they had learned and how it affected them. And they would each tell their children and grandchildren the truth about Helen and Marie. Elizabeth said clearly that this was not about claiming an identity, but about honoring their ancestors' struggle and finally telling a truth that had been hidden for too long. David added that Helen could not tell this story in her lifetime, but they could tell it now. Maybe, in some small way, they could give Helen what she never had, the chance to publicly acknowledge her mother and her heritage, even if it came more than a century late. 6 months later, the Massachusetts Historical Society opened a new exhibition titled Hidden in Plain Sight: Racial Passing and Family Secrets in 20th Century America. At the center was Helen Crawford's wedding portrait, enlarged and carefully lit, so the 2 intertwined rings were clearly visible. Rebecca stood at the opening, watching visitors move through the exhibit. It told Helen and Marie's story in detail, placing it within the wider history of racial passing, Jim Crow laws, and the painful choices faced by mixed-race families in the early 20th century. Interactive displays explained how passing worked, how documents were altered, how families were separated, and how living with constant fear took a deep emotional toll. One section displayed copies of Marie and Helen's letters, showing the pain of their separation and Marie's selfless wish for her daughter to have a better life. Another section explored how passing affected families for generations, including interviews with Helen's great-grandchildren, who spoke honestly about learning the truth. In one video, Thomas said they did not change the past or claim experiences they never lived, but they could honor the truth and recognize that racial categories had always been more complex than the law admitted. A small display case held Marie Porter's wedding ring, the silver band Helen had worn with her gold ring on her wedding day. Helen's great-grandchildren had found it among items stored after her death, kept in a box labeled simply Mother's Ring, do not discard. Helen's children, not knowing its meaning, had preserved it out of respect. Beside the ring was the only known photograph of Marie holding baby Helen, dated 1890. Her face, worn but dignified, looked out across more than a century. The caption explained who she was: a free woman of color, a seamstress, and a mother who sent her daughter north to escape segregation, sacrificing their relationships so Helen could have opportunities denied in Jim Crow Louisiana. Dr. Russo traveled from New Orleans for the opening and stood beside Rebecca, watching the crowd. She said what struck her most was how ordinary this story probably was. How many families likely carried similar secrets? Helen's story was only uncovered because Rebecca noticed 2 rings in a photograph. Rebecca nodded, thinking of all the other wedding portraits from that era and how many mothers had watched children leave to pass, And how many daughters carried hidden symbols to honor parents they could never publicly claim? A group of high school students passed through the exhibit. Rebecca overheard two girls talking in front of the portrait. One said it was terrible that people had to choose between family and basic rights. The other said it must have been terrifying to live every day knowing one mistake could destroy everything and never being able to speak about. Your mother, the first girl, pointed at the rings and said Helen still found a way to honor her mother, wearing them on her wedding day. Brave Rebecca felt tears rise, grateful that Helen's story was helping young people see history as real human lives, not just laws and dates. As the reception ended, Helen's 3 great-grandchildren stood together before the portrait with their own children and grandchildren. 4 generations gathered to honor an ancestor they had only just begun to truly know. Thomas placed his hand on his grandson's shoulder and explained who Helen and Marie were, saying they had only learned the truth recently but would never let it be forgotten again. Elizabeth said softly that Helen had spent her life hiding the truth, and now they would spend their lives making sure it was told. Rebecca looked one last time at the wedding portrait, at Helen's sad eyes and careful expression, and at the 2 rings on her finger. One represented the life she chose, the other honored the mother and past she was forced to leave behind. After 114 years, Helen's secret was finally revealed, and the mother she could never open, lie acknowledged, was finally being honored. What first appeared to be a simple wedding photograph had become a powerful record of love, sacrifice, and the human cost of unfair laws. 2 rings hidden in plain sight had carried a story across more than a century, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see the truth they held.